Sean Diddy Combs has just filed a brand new bid to get out of jail before his sentencing in a few months. From arguing he shouldn't be locked up for his swinger lifestyle, to highlighting the atrocious conditions at the MDC, to addressing allegations of violence, he is fighting for his life in this new letter to the judge.
Beyond the dull hum of the flickering fluorescent lights and the stale smell of disinfection, there was a heaviness in the air in the jail conference room. It was the sort of weight that felt like it was pressing on your skin, leaking into your lungs, and reminding you that every moment in here belonged to someone else.
Released from jail. Now, I've asked that question before so many different times here on Sidebar, but we have right now a brand new request from his legal team, a brand new filing from his defense team arguing for why he should be released now after that monumental verdict in his criminal case several weeks ago. Circumstances have changed. And I will tell you what, we did an interview a few weeks back that kind of previewed why and how Combs could be released. It was a bail bondsman that is apparently working with Diddy's team behind the scenes. I'm going to get to that a little bit later. But what I want to talk about right now is this latest letter from the defense to the judge overseeing this case, Judge Arun Subramanian. Remember, this comes after a jury of Combs' peers found him not guilty of racketeering conspiracy, not guilty of 2 counts of sex trafficking, but they did convict him of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. He's set to be sentenced on October 3rd. Technically, he could face up to 10 years in prison on each charge. Highly unlikely. I think maybe you might be looking at somewhere to 2 to 5 years potentially. But he could also get time served and be released, although that also seems unlikely. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But initially, after the verdict, right after the verdict, his defense team petitioned the court that he should be released. He was just acquitted of some very serious charges. The judge denied it. The judge denied Combs bail once again. And remember, this comes after he was rejected bail multiple times since he was arrested back in September of 2024, highlighting the severity of the charges, the violence, and so forth. But now, this is different. Now, what is the defense arguing? I'm going to go over all this in the new letter. I'm going to give my take at the end about whether or not it's going to be successful and whether or not he will actually be released before sentencing in October. So, the defense begins by arguing that Sean Combs should be released in advance of sentencing, and the court has the power to do this. They have the authority, among other things, because you can clearly show, quote, that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. So, what are those exceptions? What are those reasons? What are those circumstances that are exceptional? They highlight several things that we're going to get into. That the charges he was convicted of, we're going to call them the Mann Act violations. That's what it's called under the law. They're not as severe, they're not as egregious as other convictions in other cases. That the sheer fact that he's locked up at the MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center, for the past 11 months, that in and of itself is a reason for him to be released. These are all exceptional circumstances, and I'm going to get into all the arguments. But first, they highlight the standard. And they argue that to be released under federal law, you need to show 2 conditions. First, the district court must find by clear and convincing evidence that the person is not likely to flee or pose a danger to the safety of any other person or the community if released. Second, it must be clearly shown that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. Now, clear and convincing evidence is a lower standard, by the way. It's not like beyond a reasonable doubt. Anyway, basically, you have to show he's not a flight risk, he's not a danger, and you have to show there are particular, exceptional, unique reasons for why detaining Combs is wrong. We're going to start with the exceptional reason.
Sitting opposite his lawyer, Diddy maintained a stiff stance and fixed his eyes in a firm gaze that suggested this was not just another meeting. It wasn't a routine of motions, appeals, and procedural updates. This was hazardous, urgent, and different. His voice was low as he leaned forward, as if the walls themselves could hear. At first, the stories came in murmurs of uneasiness, in bits and pieces, information about minute changes in how he was perceived by others. There were times when the quiet in the prison hallways seemed to be a warning. The night had turned against him. There was no rest in the darkness. It denoted motion. It was a chance for the darkness to awaken. He explained the noises that roused him. There was a slight scrape on the floor. At 3 in the morning, a muffled laugh echoed down the corridor. Footsteps faded away, stopping just outside his cage. There were the notes after that. Without any explanation, little folded pieces of paper were snuck into his cage.
And they begin by trying to define, well, what exactly is exceptional circumstances? What does that mean? And they argue that case law suggests a court has a lot of discretion to determine whether a particular set of circumstances qualifies as exceptions. And they say, look, Sean Combs, his case, so different from other ones. There has never been, according to them, a Mann Act prosecution like this one before. And this is how they lay it out. Quote, there has literally never been a case like this one, where a person and his girlfriend arrange for adult men to have consensual sexual relations with the adult long-term girlfriend as part of a demonstrated swingers lifestyle and has been prosecuted and incarcerated under the Mann Act. Combs and two of his longtime girlfriends had a private, intimate life that is not uncommon today. They're talking about Jane and Cassie Ventura. Quote, it may not have been common on June 25th, 1910, when the Mann Act, or as it was originally called, the White Slave Traffic Act, was passed, but attitudes about sex and morality have come a long way in the last 115 years. It is worth noting that when the Mann Act was passed to protect the morals and decency of America's women were not allowed to vote. As noted below, perhaps due to the troubling background of this statute, whose history is rich with both racism and misogyny, the Department of Justice has limited its application to those people profiting financially from the business of prostitution and not using it to prosecute consensual adults for their own lifestyles. By the way, we covered this on a previous sidebar. The defense made an argument months ago to have these charges thrown out, called it basically racially motivated, that it was strange that it was being used against a successful black man. That argument didn't work. He was ultimately prosecuted and he was convicted on those charges. Cassie Ventura and Sean Combs went to swingers clubs and they had threesomes. Miss Ventura consistently expressed interest and enthusiasm in her intimate life with Combs, including what they called freak-offs. Jane and Sean Combs had threesomes too. When Jane and Combs watched pornography together, Jane testified that she contacted two different porn stars and invited them to join her and Mr. Combs. Both Miss Ventura and Jane testified that very often they would see the same men over and over again for years. In July of 2024, Jane testified, for instance, that she suggested to Mr. Combs that they call Paul. Jane explained that she told Combs she, quote, missed Paul. When asked why she said that, she responded, because I did. This was a lifestyle, one that both Miss Ventura and Jane chose, one they all, as grown adults, had a right to choose. Like many aspects of sex and intimacy, it was not without its complications, its bouts of jealousy, and at times, its frustrations. But that is a hallmark of any serious romantic relationship, and that is what these were, serious, long-term romantic relationships. By the way, not surprising they're really focusing on this because, again, he was acquitted of sex trafficking. They highlight how the jury didn't find sex trafficking of Jane or Cassie, that it didn't occur. There was no force, fraud, or coercion that was used to induce these women to engage in commercial sex acts. For transportation to engage in prostitution, what he was convicted of, the prosecution didn't have to prove that violence was used, or that fraud was used, or threats were used. It was just
Who left them was never seen. However, their communications were brief and ominous. One person said, "We know who you talked to." A second said, "You can't run from here." As Diddy moved from these vague threats to something more precise, something premeditated, his tone became more abrasive. He was dealing with more than just the usual perils of jail politics. Inside, there were those who followed other guidelines. They had no desire for authority or respect in the yard. Their mission appeared to be personal. "You're marked," a man murmured, locking eyes with him as he passed him in the hallway. It was claimed that the informal approach made it much riskier, as if the truth had been told bluntly and nothing could be done about it. However, it wasn't limited to prisoners. When no one else was there, he talked of guards who seemed to know more than they should, and who were sometimes in places they had no business being. Unexpectedly, cameras went down. The cell doors were left open for a bit too long. At the same moment when they should have been keeping watch, a few guards turned away. It was too well planned to have happened by accident. His lawyer tightened his grasp on his pen after the disclosure. This area had an underground economy that dealt in something riskier than drugs.
These women and men for the purposes of sex work, commercial sex acts, and obviously the jury convicted him of that. And they highlight all the jury found was that there was prostitution, payment of porn stars and escorts. And they highlight that he is a swinger or under the Mann Act, a John. And they argue he doesn't deserve to be locked up for this. Quote, Sean Combs should not be in jail for this conduct. In fact, he may be the only person currently in a United States jail for being any sort of John, and certainly the only person in jail for hiring adult male escorts for him and his girlfriend when he did not even have sex with the escort himself. Over the last 75 years, the White Slave Traffic Act has been limited to defendants who cause interstate travel for financial gain through the business of prostitution. That Sean Combs remains in jail for being convicted of being a customer of consensual adult sex services makes this case truly exceptional. Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policies of the district attorneys of Manhattan and the city attorney of Los Angeles, California, two of the three locations where this prostitution allegedly took place. In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, as a general rule, prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases. And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing.
Everything had worth, including your background, your flaws, and your argument. And that value was incalculable to someone like Diddy, who had opponents both inside and beyond these walls, as well as influence. His life was being exchanged for cash. The pen of his lawyer moved. A startling reality surfaces. Quietness frantically moves the court over the page, underlining words, circling specifics, and joining timelines. The notes resembled a legal file rather than a meeting recap. By the time Diddy had finished speaking, there was no paranoia here. This served as proof. His life was directly in danger because of this. There was an instant sense of urgency. Immediately after the meeting, the attorney called his office. The directions were exact and clipped. An emergency motion was written, examined, and ready for filing in a matter of hours. It described a string of threats and missteps that had exposed Diddy and charged the jail with egregious incompetence. It called for the adoption of special protection measures or an expeditious transfer to a secure facility. The motion didn't remain in the background for long after it was heard by the court. Although some of it was sealed, Enough of it leaked to the public to ignite a firestorm. Speculation exploded on social media.
And give his story, tell his story, give his version of events. Obviously, there are a ton of risks that come with putting a defendant on the stand, but it would be his choice. Was there a conversation about that?
Well, I mean, I can't get into, attorney-client privilege
Sure,
conversations. Obviously he thought about it, decided not to. And, as I indicated earlier, we thought the case had gone in really well for us. And so we liked where we were. So that was basically the decision.
Now, the big news, some of the big news, a lot of big news came out after the trial, was the firing of Maureen Comey, the lead prosecutor in this case. Now, there's obviously a political angle to it. There are comments that she has made, but I have to ask, you going head to head against her for so many weeks, months and before that, the firing of her, what did you make of that?
I think it was unfortunate. She's a very well-respected prosecutor. We had good sort of professional relationships with her during the course of the trial. And, I don't really think it had anything to do with the trial, but I can't really say anything beyond that. It just,
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough. Let's talk about something we can get into quite a bit. Let's talk bail. Okay, so we did a previous sidebar breaking down the defense's renewed motion for release, several arguments for why Sean Combs, should be released on bail pending sentencing, acquitted of the most serious charges. There's no comparable case of someone who is convicted of the Mann Act alone and not engaging in sex trafficking or a prostitution for financial gain, and they would be locked up like this. Talked about the issues plaguing the MDC, how it is dangerous, how he's not a risk of flight, not a danger to the community. But do you think Judge Arun Subramanian is going to be persuaded by your letter, by your motion? Because obviously he specifically highlighted after the verdict your client's violence, how the defense asserted at trial that Combs was violent. Do you think he's going to have a change of opinion now based upon the legal papers?
Well, I think we certainly hope so. And, as we pointed out in the papers, the unfortunate violence that occurred was mostly a really long time ago, other than the one incident in June that Jane testified to, which was kind of unusual. They had been together for 3 years. There had been no violence, and she essentially started the fight. I'm not excusing anything, but it was kind of a one-off, and I think the government really hadn't put in any evidence of any recent violence. The Intercontinental video, remember, that was almost 10 years ago. He broke up with Cassie in 2018. And in our reply papers yesterday, we submitted a letter from Gina Hyun, who was one of the alleged victims, a different ex-girlfriend. And I think it was a pretty powerful letter about how Sean has changed, how she's not concerned about violence. She thinks he should be released on bail. So we're hoping that will persuade the judge, given everything else, particularly, as you noted, like the really, really unusual nature of the...
Was gang politics at play here? Was there something more serious? Or was there an outside hit order? Was connected to the hierarchies of power that extended outside the institution? Worldwide, hashtags were popular. There were several theories. The reporters caught a whiff of blood. Every type of analyst they could find was brought in by news organizations. Criminologists, lawyers, former wardens, and even former prisoners who had previously been housed at the same institution. Diddy's assertions were mocked by some, who said they were just an old ploy to get preferential treatment. Others, however, who had experienced it, gave gloomy nods. They claimed that what he described was true. It seemed like a rope slowly getting tighter. The official statement from the jail administration was a masterful diversion. They did not specifically refute any of the charges, but they did promise a comprehensive inquiry that would examine them all. The silence in such omission said a lot to those who were listening. Days went by with no decision. Diddy's world became even smaller inside. In the yard, every step had to be planned.
Particular Mann Act conviction and the fact that he's already been in prison, or jail rather, for like 11 months. This case is a one-off to begin with, but we're not aware of any case like this with a Mann Act conviction where anyone's done that much time to begin with. So.
And prosecutors, I'm imagining, have come back or will come back and say, well, listen, look, after the raids on his property, he engaged, or what they would say, he allegedly engaged in criminal activity and, obviously violence, they say, with Jane. But they say, look, what was in his hotel room when he was picked up in New York. They made allegations of what he was trying to do while he was in the MDC, whether it was using other inmates' phone privileges to have three-way phone calls. That was litigated before trial. What would be your response to say, you make the point that he is a changed person. The violence that was shown during the course of this trial is from years ago. But how would you convince the judge to say, listen, we are being truthful, we are being honest, we are being forefront, that he really is a different human being? Because the judge, again, this was right after the verdict and didn't have an opportunity for a briefing schedule. How can you make the argument that he is different and that he should be trusted?
Well, I mean, I think, the point you mentioned about the arrest, I mean, unfortunately, Sean has struggled with drug addiction for a long time, and I think one of the good things and positive things is that has come out of his incarceration. It's given him an opportunity, to rehabilitate. He's committed to continuing that. He's committed to a long-term program of therapy and helping with the domestic violence problem that he's had in the past. So, at a certain point, you have to just maybe it is a leap of faith, but you have to just give a person another chance. And he really is committed to change and to there being a new chapter of service on his part. So, I think we have to hope that the judge will agree with that. And I think we've made a strong case for that.
Do you know when the judge might make a decision on bail?
We don't know.
Okay. If he denies release again, does that give you a sense of what sentencing could be like? Now, to be clear, my understanding is Judge Arun Subramanian even said at the point, if I make a decision on release, it's not indicative of where I'm leaning towards sentencing. I know there's a pre-sentencing investigation still being conducted or has been conducted. There's a lot of factors to consider. But I have to ask about whether this is going to, have an effect on sentencing. Do you believe it's going to have an effect on sentencing? Does it give you a preview of where the judge is lining up? Because my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you are probably going to be arguing for time served, maybe a minimum of 21 to 27 months. Where do you think the judge is going to go here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to take each step at a time and that the judge is not going to prejudge that. There's a lot more information he needs to get, not only the pre-sentence report, but we're going to make a very fulsome sentencing submission, and he's going to have a much more detailed picture. Even, the trial was about the charges, right? And he doesn't have the full picture.
Cafeteria meant keeping an eye on who was seated where. A gaze at the wrong moment could be seen as an insult, starting a series of events that are impossible to reverse. Short snatches of sleep were punctuated by sounds that could have been nothing or everything. His attorneys didn't let the pressure subside. They reiterated the seriousness of the threat, filed follow-up motions, and addressed the media. The risk increased with the length of time it remained unresolved. The case took on a life of its own outside the prison. There were petitions. Opinion articles debated whether Diddy's predicament was a sign of a dysfunctional system or the unavoidable result of celebrity and power merging with the harsh reality of incarceration. The prison walls were no longer the only place where tension existed. It had an impact on the general population, business community, and political arena. Celebrities have their say. Statements were made by advocacy groups. Discussions concerning prison reform, inmate safety, and the hazy boundary between justice and retaliation were sparked by the story. However, Diddy didn't care about any of that stuff as much as
the country, where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421. The defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District, in another case, basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute, justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but three warrant particular emphasis. 1. Continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2. Claims that the facility provides inadequate and or substantially delayed necessary medical care, a particular risk in this case. And 3. General issues about the conditions at the facility. These conditions have not abated in Mr. Combs' detention at the facility. As the court is aware, during Mr. Combs' incarceration at the MDC, the facility was subject to an interagency sweep that was designed to achieve our shared goal of maintaining a safe environment for both our employees and the incarcerated individuals housed at MDC Brooklyn.
Reality of getting by the following day, the threats continued. They had, if anything, become sharper. The notes were more direct now, the whispering closer, and the darkness seemed a bit heavier each time the lights went off. It had all changed when he had spoken. It turned him into a target for many, a cause for others, and a problem for others. His statements were in the record, a lasting warning of what might happen, whether the court took any action or not. And that kind of truth may be a weapon and a shield in prison, but it would always come at a price. Watching, speculating, and waiting for the next headline was all the rest of the world could do. Diddy could only get ready inside. Every second that passed took him one step closer to a conclusion that no one could yet envision, but it was felt by all. As soon as the session ended, reporters hurried to the exit, competing with one another to be the first to break the news. News alerts blared as phones lit up. In a matter of minutes, every major media was screaming headlines. Diddy receives a surprising sentencing from the judge. In the last moment of the trial, Mogul's destiny was determined. The decision wasn't the only thing the world heard. The shock of it hit them. Nearly as telling as the words itself was what followed. The music business, which had been keeping a close eye on everything, sank into a deep, deliberate hush. Suddenly, artists who used to share stages and champagne with Diddy were silent. Executives who had previously negotiated with him behind closed doors were now continuing to do so.
Combs has been a model inmate for his nearly year-long period of confinement. The violent conditions are still very much a concern for Mr. Combs and is an unnecessary confinement risk given the clear precedent of multiple similarly situated Mann Act convictions where defendants were released on conditions. Now, the government, by the way, would probably disagree with that statement of him being a model inmate. Remember when they accused Combs of trying to arrange three-way phone calls and buying the use of other inmates' phone privileges to try to make sure the government wasn't listening in, that he was having these private conversations, that he was allegedly trying to contact witnesses in the case, that he allegedly orchestrated a birthday campaign to help his public image while he was locked up. So if we hear a government response, I'm sure they're going to say something about that. Then, the defense highlights he's not a risk of flight, he's not a danger to the community, which, by the way, I think are real key points here. But they seem to echo a lot of the same arguments that they have already stated to the court. And remember, they haven't been successful in the past. That he voluntarily came to New York last year to surrender himself to authorities, that he gave up his passport to his attorneys 6 months before his arrest, paid off his mortgage on his Miami home so it was free and clear for him to stay at while out on bond. He was just acquitted of the most serious charges that he was facing, which, by the way, carried decades, if not life in prison. That he's not a risk of flight. That's the basic argument. Now, when it comes to the danger argument, that is key. Why? Judge Subramanian had said after the verdict that the reason he was denying bail was because of Combs' violence, that his own attorneys admitted he was violent during the course of the trial. Well, here is what Combs' defense attorneys argue about that. Quote, the court noted that the defense admitted a history of domestic violence as to Miss Ventura and that he struck Jane twice in June 2024. However, we strenuously object that Mr. Combs poses a danger to the community, aside from a single instance on June 18, 2024, where Mr. Combs was provoked by Jane through her own acts of violence. There was no evidence of any acts of violence in the last 7 years. Indeed, the jury notably rejected the government's argument that the June 2024 incident constituted coercion when it acquitted Mr. Combs of the sex trafficking charge. Also, prior to his arrest in this case, Mr. Combs enrolled in a domestic violence program in which he participated until he was arrested and incarcerated in connection with this case. If released on conditions, Sean Combs will not be violent to anyone. As we said in court, this jury gave him his life back, and and he will not squander his second chance at life, nor would he do anything to further jeopardize his 7 children not having a father and 4 of his children not having a parent at all. The court can fashion any set of conditions, and Mr. Combs will abide by any condition to make the court comfortable that Mr. Combs will not be violent toward any person. And that is when they propose the following bail package: that Combs will sign a $50 million bond secured by his home in Miami, that the bond will be co-signed by 3 financially responsible people, that Combs will reside in his home in Miami, that his travel will be limited to the Southern District of Florida, the Southern District of New York for attorney meetings, as well as airports that are necessary.
There was no loyalty in the stillness for very opposite reasons. It was a matter of survival. No one wanted their name to be associated with this. Diddy wasn't the only one affected by the judge's ruling. It spread outward, affecting everyone within his orbit. The message was also unambiguous. The previous regulations have been abandoned, the ones that allowed strong men to survive storms unharmed. They are not functioning as they once did. It remains to be seen if that is a step forward or merely an anomaly, but it feels like a change right now. The symbolism nearly overshadowed the sentence's length. This was about removing the shield of notoriety and asserting that fame does not grant one a special form of justice. This is the kind you receive. And one of the most untouchable people in entertainment will spend years, if not decades, in a place where none of the accoutrements matter, if this is true, and the appeals are unsuccessful. Here is the opposing viewpoint, though. This has happened to us previously. High-profile convictions that appear to be definitive have been weakened in backroom deals or overturned on a little-known technicality. Additionally, if anyone
is going to consider, there's going to be a big fight about the sentencing guidelines. We think actually we're going to end up arguing for an even lower guideline range than we had originally believed at the time of the verdict, where we didn't have we had like a couple of hours to try to figure out what to say about bail. So, I hope the judge will grant bail, but I feel confident that even if he doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to sentence Sean to time served. He's going to take everything into account when he gets all the submissions. And, I've got a lot of confidence that the judge is going to be fair and not prejudge the situation.
And you also have this motion for judgment of acquittal, that the Mann Act convictions should be tossed out, Combs be granted at a minimum a new trial. Number of very interesting arguments that are present, and it's basically that there has really never been, as we talked about, a prosecution conviction on a Mann Act like this, that Combs wasn't profiting off of the business. They were all consenting adults that were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking, that this isn't even prostitution per se, it's more voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but paid them for their time. They were all having a good time. There's a First Amendment argument that the freak-offs and the hotel nights were performances that were videotaped so he could watch them later. It's amateur pornography. There's an argument that he was prejudiced because of all the other evidence that came in to prove RICO or sex trafficking, but would never have come in if this was merely a prosecution for the Mann Act violations. Specifically, we talk about the Intercontinental Hotel footage. But couldn't the counter argument be, if you look at the text messages and voice notes and the travel, hotel, the payment documentation, that these charges, the Mann Act charges, could have been proven based on that evidence alone and not anything else about racketeering or sex trafficking?
Well, I think that I don't agree with that. I think that, as we argued in the papers, the government didn't really show that the purpose of the travel was to have sex for money, and that in fact all the testimony and a lot of the other evidence showed that the men were being paid for their time. But even if we were wrong about that one, we have a number of the other arguments that you mentioned that really aren't undermined by those records. So for instance, one of our main arguments is that this statute, which used to be called the White Slave Traffic Act, it has this long history, but even with this long history, it's never been applied to a case like this. The term prostitution in a lot of states doesn't include this conduct, even if someone's being paid. If the person making the payment is paying essentially to observe other people having sex, that's not prostitution. So we've got the First Amendment argument, as you mentioned, and the new trial argument. So all of those arguments, I think, are independent of, the issue you raised, which But so we think we have a really strong motion, and so we're hoping the judge will agree.
The relationships and the unyielding determination to explore every possibility. Diddy is here. His crew won't stop working. If necessary, they will contest every provision, every decision, and every witness account. Whether that will work in this climate is the matter at hand. The public no longer tolerates such preferential treatment. That has been ensured by social media. Millions of people will analyze, discuss, and evaluate every development in real time. Even the strongest players may reconsider under such pressure. But for the time being, the situation is harsh. Diddy is facing a prison sentence that cannot be converted into a brief reprieve from the limelight. It's not a refuge here. Exile is what this is. And if nothing changes, the man who established his reputation as unstoppable will discover what it's like to have absolutely no control. Perhaps that was the reason the occasion felt so weighty. Because it was more than a trial's conclusion. It was a conclusion of a tale that had been repeated to us for years. That there are always those people who manage to get out. Not only did the judges gavel in the case, it also put